Hey guys, Sebastian here from Potzer Analytics. Today we're going to be talking about a crucial aspect of developing a plan, which is identifying weaknesses, specifically pawn weaknesses. And today we're going to be looking at pawn weaknesses because pawns play a crucial role in defining the structure of the board, and they make really good targets because they're the weakest material on the board and they're very slow. So today we're going to talk about how to identify weaknesses and how you should be developing a plan to attack those weaknesses. So the first type of weakness we're going to look at is the isolated pawn. So here white has an isolated pawn on c3. An isolated pawn is a pawn that doesn't have any pawns of the same color on any of the neighboring files. So here white doesn't have any white pawns on the B or D files. So that makes the pawn on c3 an isolated pawn. And isolated pawns are weak because they don't have any other pawns to protect it, so it has to rely on the other pieces to protect it. And the ideal way to attack an isolated pawn is to use the queen and one rook. And the reason we want this is because we want to trade off our minor pieces to eliminate any chance of counterplay coming from these minor pieces. And we want to keep the queen on the board because the queen is enough of a threat to the king that's going to keep the king away from this pawn. So the queen will keep the king at bay. And we also want to keep one rook on the board to help the queen in the attack. So the ideal matchup for attacking an isolated pawn is to have the queen and one rook. That means if black was to create a strategy on how they should go about attacking this isolated pawn in c3, step one would be to trade off the minor pieces and one of the rooks. So black wants to trade off the knights and one of these rooks. Step two would be to fix the weakness in place. So we want to make sure that this pawn, this isolated pawn, does not move forward. It does not trade off. We want it to stay exactly where it is so that we can gang up on it. So that means black needs to control this square, c4, the one right in front of the pawn. And next, black wants to create a battery to attack this pawn. So black's going to create a battery. And then lastly, if that's not enough, just keep applying pressure and gang up on that pawn until eventually it will crumble. Okay, so now that you know the strategy that black should be going for, what would you do in this position? If you were black, what would be your move? Okay, let's see what black actually does here. So black plays rook takes b3, exactly trying to trade off the minor pieces. So white captures back with his rook, black takes with his knight, the queen captures back. So step one has been achieved, trade off the minor pieces. Now step two should be to fix the weakness in place. So let's see how black does that. Black plays rook c4, and this is accomplishing two things. Black is creating this battery against the pawn with his queen and the rook, and he's also stopping this pawn from advancing by placing a piece right in front of the pawn. So this is a really good way to fix a weakness in place, is to place a piece right in front of it. And there's also a very important other aspect of this move, which is this rook is creating a pin against the white rook. So this pawn is now pinned to the white rook, and that's actually really important because this pawn will not be able to defend itself from any other attacks. So when possible, always be looking to how you can create pins against weaknesses. And here we see white doesn't really have anything to do. Black is attacking this pawn with two pieces. White is defending it with two pieces. So black can't immediately take it, but white also can't just abandon it because then he'll lose it. So let's see what white does here. White just pushes a pawn, and like we said, black can't immediately take it, so the next step is to keep applying pressure. And this is where the pin really comes in handy. So this pin on the rook means that now, because the white pawn cannot move, this allows black to push his pawn and apply pressure. And so black does that, pushes his pawn to d4. White cannot take it, otherwise he'll lose the rook. So white plays queen to d1, and now black gets to enjoy the spoils of all his hard work, and he plays rook takes c3. So if we go back all the way to the beginning. First, black identified his weakness, which was the isolated pawn. He decided that the best way to attack his weakness is to trade off the minor pieces, so trading off the knight, and getting rid of one of the rooks in order to leave the queen and one rook on the board. And then he knew that in order to win this isolated pawn, he needed to fix the pawn in place, so control the square right in front of it, creating a battery with his queen and rook, and then finally keep applying pressure. So if you can see all of that from this initial position, that's a really good indication that you're understanding how to start developing a plan to attack weaknesses. The next type of weakness we're going to talk about is a backward pawn. A backward pawn is a pawn that does have pawns on neighboring files. However, it's behind its neighboring pawns. So here, for example, black has backward pawns on a6, c6, and f7. Also, white has backward pawns on b3, f2, and h2. So all of these are backward pawns because they do have neighboring pawns, but they're behind their neighboring pawns. However, not all of these are the same weaknesses. In particular, the pawn on a6 is extremely vulnerable because it lies on a half-open file. So backward pawns become very vulnerable on half-open files. The other backward pawns are not as easy to attack. So white should be thinking, okay, this is my target, a6. I should be using the exact same principles of attacking the isolated pawn to attacking this backward pawn. So we're going to see all the same ideas play out. In this case, white chooses to skip the first step of trading off the minor pieces, and white is going to go about just fixing the weakness in place. And this is a really, really important idea, is that when you've identified a weakness, you need to isolate it. You need to fix it in place, which means stop the pawn from advancing. So let's see how white does that. White plays b4. And this is a really, really instructive move because this move is now stopping the black pawn from advancing, and it allows the rook to swing over onto the a file, which is going to allow white to create a battery and gang up on this weakness. So let's see how black responds. Black plays rook c7, and now white begins his attack. So he's placing one of his rooks on the a file. Black defends. White brings over his second rook, creating a battery on this pawn. Now black plays rook a7, and white keeps ganging up on it. So white has created what's called Alekine's gun. When you see this stack up of one rook followed by another and then the queen, this stack up is called Alekine's gun, which is a super powerful battery. And whenever you make a battery, it's always really important to place the rook in front and the queen behind, because we want the first capture to come from the rook. And here, black has run out of time to defend the pawn. Let's see what black plays. Queen f8. If black had another move, he'd be able to defend it, but he doesn't. So now white gets to just chomp on a6. And white has won his weakness. So if we go all the way back to the beginning, step one, super important, is to fix the weakness in place. So if you can see that the backward pawn a6 is the target, step one is I'm going to fix that weakness in place, then I'm going to create a battery and gang up on it, then good job. The next type of weakness we're going to talk about is doubled pawns. So doubled pawns are two pawns that are on the same file. So here white has doubled pawns on c3 and c4. And doubled pawns are weak because pawns attack diagonally. So two doubled pawns cannot defend each other because they're not diagonal to each other. So doubled pawns are weak. Usually they're a little bit harder to attack. In this particular case, both these pawns on c3 and c4 are also backward pawns. So these two pawns are doubled backward pawns, which are very weak. So this is going to be a little bit easier for black to attack. So here black has identified, okay, these are my weaknesses that I'm going to target, and the exact same ideas play at hand here. We want to gang up on these weaknesses. So let's see what black plays. Black plays queen to a5. Black defends this pawn on c3. And now black says, okay, you've defended the pawn on c3, but I'm still going to come after your other weakness on c4. Black plays queen a4, attacking this weakness. And here white has no response. He just has to let the pawn on c4 fall. So black plays rook c1, and black takes the pawn on c4. So back to the beginning. Identifying that these doubled pawns are the target, and black says, okay, these are my targets. How am I going to gang up on them? So there's another reason that doubled pawns are weak, and the reason is because if double pawns make it to the endgame, it's very difficult to promote doubled pawns. So here white has double pawns on the b file. So materially this game is even. Both players have 3 pawns. But the problem for white is that he has double pawns, and that's actually going to make it really, really hard for white to promote one of these pawns. So let's see, just play it out and see why it's so hard to promote double pawns. So white chooses to plow straight ahead with his pawn majority. White plays b4. Black plays b5 to stop the pawn from going any further. Now white is going to try and push this pawn to c4. So first he's going to play b3. Let's see what black plays, pushing his majority on the king side. Now white plays c4. And here, this is exactly why double pawns are really hard to promote, because black doesn't have to do anything at all. If black takes, that would allow white to undouble his pawns, and then that would be a problem for black. But black doesn't have to do that. He just needs to defend this pawn on b5. So let's see what black plays. Black plays c6. Now, when white captures, black captures back, white is left with his double pawns, and black only needs 1 pawn to stop 2 of white's pawns. So that's why double pawns suck to promote. And here, in this position, black is left with a fox and the chicken coop position. So if you've seen any of our previous videos, you already know the strategy on how to win a fox and chicken coop position. I'm not going to play it out, but this position is a win for black. So even though materially it's even, black will win this game. So even worse than doubled pawns are tripled pawns. So here we have a position where if you're white, you are up a pawn and you're probably feeling pretty good because you're close to a winning endgame. But the problem is this position is black to move. So that allows black to cripple white's pawn structure. And black is going to create tripled pawns for white. So if you were black, see how you could create tripled pawns for black. What would you play here? So let's see what black actually does. Black plays queen takes b3. A pawn takes back. Black captures the bishop. White takes back, and now white is left with tripled pawns, which are 3 pawns on the same file. And the same idea here, black only needs 1 pawn to stop all 3 of white pawns. So white can't push any of these pawns, and black is going to use his pawn majority on the king side to create a fox and chicken coop position on the king side and win this game. So triple pawns are the weakest out of all of the different pawn weaknesses. Okay, so let's go to our last position here. And what really separates the weak players from the strong players is that strong players are able to create weaknesses in their opponent's pawn structure. So even when you don't really see any obvious weaknesses, strong players are able to create those weaknesses. So looking at this position, black doesn't have any isolated pawns or doubled or tripled pawns. Black has backward pawns on b7, e7, f7, h7, but all of these are not really easily attackable because they're not on half open files, so they're not really vulnerable. And so white should be thinking, okay, how do I create weaknesses? And if you were white, what would you play in this position? I'll give you a few seconds. So this is something that somebody in the 1600 or 1800 rating range would come up with. And let's see what white plays. White plays knight to d5. So this is a really, really clever tactical shot. So the purpose of this is that white ultimately wants to capture with his knight and bishop on f6, and it's going to result in pawn taking on f6. But there's a lot of nuance going on with this particular move. So it opened up the discovered attack of the bishop on f6, and it's forking the queen on c7 and f6. Also, the knight has opened up a discovered attack of the rook, pinning the bishop to the queen. So there's a lot going on here, and black can't immediately capture this knight, because if black takes, then white captures back with his pawn, and then the pawn will be attacking the bishop, but the bishop can't move because it's pinned to the queen. So this fork means that the queen needs to move because it's being attacked by the knight, and the knight cannot immediately take it. And if the queen moves, that's exactly what white wants, because then white is going to capture with both his pieces on f6, and black will be forced to capture back with his pawn, leaving black with double pawns on the f file and an isolated pawn on d6. So if you can see the end result of this move here, that's really, really good to starting to think, how am I going to create weaknesses in my opponent's pawn structure? So let's see how this plays out to see exactly the end result of that. So black plays queen d8. Now white captures on f6. Black captures back with his bishop. White captures with his bishop. Black takes with his pawn. And so now black has created doubled pawns on the f file and an isolated pawn on d6. So white has succeeded in creating weaknesses. His next short-term strategy would be, okay, now that I've created weaknesses, my next step is going to be to target this isolated pawn on d6. So implementing the sort of ideas that we talked about before of trading off the minor pieces, I'm going to fix the weakness in place by controlling the square right in front of the pawn. I'm going to create a battery by bringing my rook in, and then I'm going to gang up on that weakness. So all of this is to create a short-term strategy, then create another short-term strategy, and that is really the fundamental basis of building a plan in chess. So that's it for today's video on pawn weaknesses. We talked about isolated pawns, backward pawns, doubled and triple pawns, and how to go about creating a plan to attack those weaknesses. Like and subscribe to get free access to all of our lessons on Lichess, and I will see you guys in our next video.